Good evening, everyone. We are live. Thank you for being here. My name is David Johnson of Transform Ed Consulting. And first of all, I want to give kudos to my dear colleague, Cassandra Williams, who is the brains behind Educational Innovations 360 Degrees. I thank you for allowing us to use your channel. Our guest tonight is my brother, my sibling. We are of the same alma mater, Michael Pestella. He is Associate Director of Leadership Development, State University of New York at Oswego. He has almost countless years of experience as a higher education student affairs professional, having served in multiple roles at multiple institutions in multiple states. In addition to studying student affairs in higher education, Michael holds certificates in leadership and management and advanced intercultural management. His awards include the Student Engagement Award, the Outstanding Student Organization Advisor Award, and his alma mater's Distinguished Service Award. Michael and I both bear the indelible mark of the State University of New York College at Potsdam, Old Home Week, where we enjoyed an uncommon college experience that fostered an appreciation of and respect for the variety of human experience. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And it is great to share your show with you and your audience. And I love the fact that we didn't even plan this, but we are both in our Bears gear and supporting the alma mater tonight.
That's right. You can't see my shirt, but I'm dressed to the nines with all of my Potsdam bling. The cap, the shirt, and the shorts as well have Potsdam on them. So Mike, I want to ask you some things about your background. So you have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and you studied student affairs. But tell us what intercultural management is.
Sure. So I had the opportunity a few years ago to do some professional development because I'd put together a proposal for our AVP to do some things with leadership and management. And as part of that, I shared with him that there was a chance to also get an intercultural certificate from Dr. Tulija at Notre Dame. And he said, go for it. And it was fantastic to spend this time online and to learn directly from the professor and talk about defining community and all the things. A lot of their focus was management based, but it was also really about opening one's mind, seeing where you are with things. And it was before a lot of people were necessary, because this was 9-10 years ago. So there, the conversations about implicit bias weren't as prevalent then as they are now, but it was almost like it was ahead of the game, because it was like, how are you aware of where you are with things? And then how does that affect how you work with others? And then kind of a crash course, and with an international flair. So if you were welcoming someone from Japan to your team, what that might be like versus welcoming someone from Germany or someone from Nigeria, and how that would play out. And it was really a wonderful certification program.
Well, I have lots of questions about that program. First of all, I differentiate leadership and management. So in the case of intercultural management, what does management entail? What does management mean here?
I think the focus of the program was looking at how do you as a leader and or a manager, depending on what relationship you're engaged with in that moment, because you could be a manager but be engaged in a leadership process, where you could also be being a leader in a community group or in a setting for work as well, have an awareness of culture, the role that it plays, and how that impacts building your team, which really plays into building one's community, which is the core of what we're talking about tonight, in regards to how do you bring the, folks together, because you may be working with someone who grew up in Latin America, and their approach to the day might be a little different than the person from Scandinavia, and how you can build that community and team together by being aware of culture and strengths and what everyone brings to the table, because we're richer together. But if you go into it blind, there's a chance that it could lead to conflict.
Well, you spoke about this program, and you said it was almost like ahead of the curve. Sounds like some of the things you mentioned just now speak of cultural competence.
I would agree. I think, part of it was learning, but also learning from that wonderful image of the iceberg. That, what when we see or think of or at first look at a culture, we only see the part of the iceberg above the water. And we don't see everything behind that as far as the personal struggle and the work and the history and, anything from colonialism to interfamily problems and trauma and where that goes and how but so what we see versus what we take time to learn and really know and appreciate and allow someone to express themselves and being welcoming and collaborative in nature and realizing that we bring what we bring to the table, but we need to be aware of what everyone brings to the table.
Let's talk about your awards for a moment. The Student Engagement Award, the Outstanding Student Organization Advisor Award. What were you doing? What were the things that you obviously did so well that you were awarded for them? What were those specific things? What the things that you did on the ground with your own hands, with your own mind, that gained those awards for you?
Well, I have to say the receiving the Outstanding Advisor Award was and is, and that was this spring, so it was for last academic year. Extraordinarily humbling experience for me. I used to facilitate and coordinate the Student Involvement Awards process for SUNY Oswego. I no longer do that; another colleague does, and I was there to support our students and our student leaders, and I was asked to present an award. So I was there for that. And I was actually casually looking at my notes for the award that I was going to be presenting and wasn't fully present in the ceremony and thought I heard my name and was like, oh my gosh, did I like space or something? I'm like 2 awards away from my award. I'm not presenting yet. And then there was this clapping and some of the student leaders started screaming Mike. And I was like, oh, wow, I'm receiving an award.
Now, did your students nominate you for that or your colleagues?
That was totally student based. And it actually came, and they didn't even know it. I was nominated twice. I advise Delta Phi Epsilon sorority on campus, and I also advise our Asian Student Association. And both ASA and DPhi-E nominated me, and they didn't even know that each other had done it. And it was just a real powerful thing to receive that and see the appreciation of the students in that setting. Honestly, it was one of the more...
The real thing I want to know is if I wanted such an award, what would I do to get it? But we probably better move on. We've been chatting and talking about your experience and your credibility, but we probably better move on. Now, the title of our conversation tonight is Building Community Through Involvement and Leadership. But you have a relational leadership model, obviously from some studies that you have been conducting. Tell us about the author and even tell us how to pronounce the name correctly.
Well, first, I will say that I may be pronouncing it wrong, but I've always pronounced it for Susan Comavies, for Dr. Comavies. And her work is, I have the wonderful opportunity to instruct a first choice class in the fall of each semester at SUNY Oswego, and in the spring, I instruct a upper division leadership course. And I think that the relational leadership model and the 5 components, purposeful, inclusive, empowering, ethical, and process oriented, when you utilize them in a leadership relationship, they really can be the roadmap, or they could be your directions to how to develop a community. And in some of the challenges that we're seeing, not just in higher education, but in our neighborhoods, in our states, in our country, in our world, I think is a breakdown in community, in how we civilly interact with each other. And I really think those 5 components, when used the right way, can help strengthen or build or give direction to a community.
Well, let's talk about community for a moment before we dig into those 5 models, or the models of 5 components. What is your definition of community? We chatted a little bit earlier, and there could be a community of the mind, meaning we are persons of like minds, or there's an actual physical community. I live in a physical community. So when you say community, which do you mean?
So I'm pretty open about it in that, where you have intent, where you have a shared purpose, where you, or maybe have a shared geographic space, there are different levels of community. So, but it's not always there. It's how you build it or not. So took, now I'll admit it took me a season or two to have the light bulb go off in my own head. Um, but I thought about, how do I use these 5 points with the youth soccer teams that I coach? And then how do I use these points when I'm doing some stuff in town council? Because I've used them with student organizations that range from women's rugby to the Black Student Union for years. But then I was like, this isn't just about higher ed and student organizations, because this is where that out of classroom experience, where we do the beauty of our work in helping student leaders grow and learn and be better versions of themselves, if they can start to learn these components and use the model now, hopefully when they're on the PTA, hopefully when they're running for mayor, or they're getting involved with BLM or other things taking place, they can use this.
Mike, that raises a question. And you've done a lot of different things in student affairs. When you speak of leadership, we started talking about community. When you speak of leadership, are you speaking of developing the leadership in the students with whom you work, or are you speaking of the leadership that you have applied to the student organization? For example, if you were an advisor to a student organization, were you advising students on how to develop their own leadership skills, or were you using your leadership in your advisor role?
Yes.
Yes, that's a goal. Okay.
So for me, I really look at leadership as this collaborative relationship with leaders and participants, or collaborators, or followers, or whatever word you'd like to use. And if you have this mutual purpose and it's for an outcome that's good for everyone, or good for the mission of the organization in this case, how do you work for that? And to me, it's utilizing the role, but if you take like a servant leadership mentality to it, so that it's like, I'm here to serve you as the advisor, and the flipped pyramid of, I love when student leaders might come in and be like, well, I'm president now, so they have to do what I say. And I'm like, all right, well, let's talk about that. And over a period of time, I'll try and walk them down the road of, you're president now, so you have to do what all they say. And it's like, whoa, where they do the 180, and it's like, wait, no, they don't. It's like, no, now you serve them. They don't serve you. And trying to show that if they take that approach to leadership, versus where when they have to manage something and have that hierarchy and realize, look, we have this program, we have a flow chart that makes the program work well. We need to manage it. And we know David's going to do this, Mike's going to do this, Cassandra's going to do that. And if you don't do it, you're going to hurt the group, and we're going to hold each other accountable for that.
So in your work with students then, are you using the relationship leadership model, or are you teaching the relational leadership model?
So depending on the setting, it could be either one. So it's one of those things that's ingrained in what I do, but it's also something formally in the classroom, but informally in working with those governing bodies and student organizations and leaders, where it's taught as well. And sometimes it's very direct. Hey, let's look at these 5 components and what does it mean to your organization, ASA? And sometimes it's very indirect, and it's like, well, let's think about this. What is your mission and what is your purpose?
Right.
And how are you?
Speaking of that, we better jump into these 5 components. And you just mentioned purpose. Would you like to start there?
Sure. So with an intentional community, so it could be that student organization, it could be our Asian Student Association that advise, or it could be that soccer club, or it could be your community governance body. It's really being aware of what is our purpose. and how are we working to make that mission and purpose come to life. So an easy example would be, if we're the volleyball club, we probably shouldn't be trying to hold a video game tournament, or if we are the dance club, we probably shouldn't be trying to do something in investments and tell the stock club what to do. Now, it's okay to be members of both of those groups, but what is your purpose and how does it play out? So, in
Are you
that
familiar with
respect,
the term stick to your knitting?
oh, okay.
that,
Yeah,
that comes from In
because
Search of Excellence. That's a few years back, but same idea. Stick to your knitting. What is it that you do, and make sure you do that well. Go on. I'm
exactly.
sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's perfect. And knowing
Uh-huh.
what that purpose is and
Uh-huh.
what your role in that as a leader or a participant or a collaborator and how that can change. Because you may start out as a participant and become a leader, or you may
Okay.
start out as a leader and then move back and be the
Okay.
participant that way.
All right. Well, how does inclusive fit into this model, or which role does inclusive fit play?
Now, with inclusive, one of the more it's one of the easiest assignments I give students in my fall class, and they're all first year students in that class. But I've seen some of them then become officers of clubs, and it gives it to them in kind of a safe way to think about inclusion, but then it could be broadened so much. Is that one of their first assignments is to go to two student organization meetings, and the new students, even though they know who I am, they don't really know what I do. So they'll be like, yeah, I went to this organization. They greeted me at the door. They involved me in a conversation. They asked me to join a committee. They put me on their listserv. I'm in their Snapchat, and it's fantastic. And then someone else will be like, well, I went to the meeting. They had these really strict rules. And I'll be like, oh, it was a Robert's Rules meeting? Yeah. I wasn't allowed to talk or ask questions. And it was all like from these two people at the front of the room who kind of talked to the group. And then I left. And if it wasn't for signing a sheet of paper, they don't even know I'm there. And so it's like, okay, well, you didn't feel included. What group, which one of those two are you going to go back to? Which one of those two are you going to care more about the purpose? But then when we take that wider and think about inclusion from the DEI perspective of how are we including our diverse community and how are we building equity and moving people forward? And if you can see that if anyone can experience, I didn't feel included in this meeting because of the way it was done, now take that to another level and think about why someone isn't included because of their
Yeah.
personal identity markers.
Yeah. Understood. Okay. Empowering.
So I think empowering can be a few things. It can be an environment that empowers others. It could be a relationship between a couple of people. So you've empowered me tonight to share part of my message and some of the work I do. And, we've both empowered students at our alma mater to help them with guidance when we go back for committees, be it from the foundation board or the alumni board, and how we work with student leaders that way. In where we train that particularly in the student organization realm, but it also prepares them for all those experiences beyond that, is student orgs constantly turn over. You can have a group win the organization of the year and 2 years later fall off the yard
Yeah.
because they didn't empower, they didn't train, they didn't create the sustainability of the next level of officers.
Sustainability. Right. Yeah.
And if
We
they
used
don't
to
learn
jokingly
that,
say they open up a new box of students. So every time it's not a one time shot. You got to repeat with that new group of students. And
yeah,
the key word you said was sustainability. Um, so whether the responsibility for sustaining the organization falls upon your shoulders as an advisor or the student shoulders, there must be some continuity built in.
exactly, because that will keep the organization healthy and moving forward. And you're going to see cycles. You see cycles in businesses. You see it throughout many different communities that way. But how you minimize the down part of that cycle, to keep things, or so that you don't get into a cycle that goes down enough where you don't exist in 3 years.
Empowering. Say a little bit more about that, if you would. Often, when the term empower is used, it's still granted by someone with power and authority. I am empowering you to address this particular issue. From where does empowerment come?
I think you can create a community. You can have a setting. It could be a group, it could be a place of employment, it could be a board where it's built into your values. It actually bridging empowering and ethical, where it becomes like an ethic or standard of what you do. But I also, in where that allows safety, where you can see as that new participant or collaborator, there's the opportunity for me to do this, and it's nurtured and it's encouraged. And sometimes it's self. I've got to take charge of this, or I have to challenge this, or I have to move it forward. And sometimes it's helping the other person. So at an orientation session the other day, part of what I opened it up with was, and I knew strategically that my groups left my presentation and went to lunch. So I introduced myself, kind of went over what we're going to talk about with engagement. And then I was like, okay, find someone new near you and ask them, why are you here? Why are you at Oswego? What's one thing you hope to accomplish this fall? And what's a question you don't have answered? And then I wait until the conversation starts going really well. And I get on the mic and I'm like, okay, let's bring it all back together again. And I'm like, I know you didn't finish. And that was by design, because you're going to go from here to lunch and it would have been easy to go off by yourself or do this or that. So
Okay.
now I want you to talk to each other and I want you to have this connection. And part of that might be, hey, you know what? David really wants to go to see this ensemble at Crane. And Mike really wants to go to see this thing for Geology Club in Timmerman. But we're both a little afraid, or maybe one of us is afraid to walk in the door alone. So it's like, all right, David, I'll go with you if you go with me. And how do we start to do that? And that's like a
So
very
would you say
small
that's an
version.
example of empowerment?
I think in a micro scale, yes.
Okay.
I think it is.
All right. So how does ethical fit into the scheme of the relational leadership model?
Well, I think ethical is that next level of the first three, but especially in some ways the purpose of what are our values and our standards. And they may not be written in that mission statement, but how we conduct ourselves. And so how do we realize that, with student organizations, sure, you can do certain things, but what other things can you do? And where does that play out? And I know a beautiful example was a couple of years, well, shortly before the pandemic, when our Pride Alliance did a program with women's rugby about athletes as allies and how that played out. So it was one of those things where there were a number of students in both organizations, and how do we make this statement about athletes? So one could say, I'm contradicting myself. Well, why is rugby doing this program? It's not rugby, but rugby was doing it with pride, and they learned this is the way that we should do this and how we should do it, and work with the other expert organization. And how do we do this in the community to share that athletes need to be allies and we all need to be accepting, and where things play out that way. And that's an ethic. That's a belief of the groups.
Okay. All right. I actually sounded more like process oriented. How do we do this? It sounded like process oriented. So then you circled back to ethical. So then in your mind, what would be a definition of ethical?
So I think that it kind of like leadership, depending which book you pick up, they're going to define ethical a little differently. But for me, I think in this case, and with Comavies, a lot of it is, what are your values? What are your standards? But then how do you adhere to them? How do you practice them? How do you see that judgment's in place? So In this case, with women's rugby, for example, if they then had a member who was not inclusive and not being respectful of the community or their members that way, and regardless of their who they're involved with, how they identify, what their
Mhm.
sexuality is, that they would be able to say, that's not ethical. That's not part of what we
Mm.
represent. Well, we're here to play rugby. We're here for everyone to play rugby.
Okay.
And we support all of our members and their success and their love and their values that way.
Okay. All right. Well, then talk a little bit more about process oriented so that we could see the difference between ethical and process.
So I think process oriented is kind of the glue, or if you were making a one of those like everything in the kitchen cookies, so you throw in the raisin, you throw in the chocolate chip, you got some of the oats in there, and it's like it's like that dough that's going to bring it all together. It's going to bind it, and that can be very specific. It can be we're going to do this event. We're going to put on this information fair. And we know we have to reserve the room so far in advance. And we have to do the digital sign so far in advance. And we have to publicize this way in social media and whatever that may be.
Mhm.
And going through the checklist. So it can literally be what is your checklist? What is your
Okay.
process? How does that work out? But it also could be your constitution for a student organization, your standing orders for a group. What are the general rules in that youth sport in regards to knowing that the real little kids can't do headers in soccer because of
Mhm.
brain development and worried about concussion protocol, things that weren't there when we might have played youth sports. And so in some cases it could be quite rigid, and in
Mhm.
some cases it might be that loose set of rules, but it's that process of what you do.
Okay. Now we've talked about the five components of the relational leadership model. And we did touch on application as we talked about each of the components, but let's focus specifically on application right now. How does one put all of this to work?
Yeah, so I think as you're looking at your community or you're looking at your organization or you're looking at your office, and you're gonna be able to apply things a little differently in different settings,
Mhm.
but thinking about, are we working to our purpose? Are we performing to our purpose? Are we on point with our mission? And with that, are we being inclusive? And are we being aware of what that means? And it could be, one of those things like doing a strengths inventory and knowing, hey, we have someone who's really strong in these skills, but now they took a job somewhere else. So we don't have that anymore. And how do we attract someone with that? But also, how is it inclusive of where's our market? Where's our demographic? How have we changed as students and impact that way? And knowing, I know, I don't know if I should name names, but we had a very famous alum who might occasionally talk about the weather on the Today Show. Come back to visit Oswego, and he did an impromptu visit at our Alana multicultural dinner. And he came in, and one of the biggest points he made was, he's like, when I was here as a student in the 70s, one table would represent the students of color here. He goes, look at us. There's 200 and something people in this hall. Look at where we've come and where we're going, and how does that work for inclusion? And to hear that from this leader, from this famous alum that way, and that impact on the students of, you're part of my legacy, but don't be
Mhm.
impressed by me, impressed by what you can do, so that when you come back,
Mhm.
it's the whole next level that way.
So, Mike,
And
it sounds like when you speak of application, you're talking about that common term we use, walking the talk. So, of those five components we discussed, application is doing what you said you would do.
exactly,
All right, my
how
friend,
do
we
you,
have only seconds remaining. You've talked
okay.
about a lot of different things. What is the single takeaway you would like to have people take from our conversation?
So I think if you're looking to strengthen, or if you're looking to keep that sustainability, or if you're looking to really have a renaissance, rebirth, look at your where you work, your organization, your community impact, is jot down, take a screenshot, jot down those five components, look them up a little bit, and think about, how can I mindfully, as a participant or collaborator, or maybe someone, as you noted, David, who has the power, has the title, has the influence and resource. How do you think about applying them? And again, it could be in your work setting, it could be in your civic engagement in your community, it could be what you do with youth, and it could be a lot of different ways. But if you think about those, I think you can help build a community where people are civil to each other, where
Mhm.
they understand where they are. And if we do that in lots of small areas, I
Mhm.
think we can actually start to turn around our greater communities and our states and our country that way.
Well, Mike, if people want to know more, how shall they contact you?
So you're welcome to email me. However, you're also welcome to add me in LinkedIn and message me there. And so feel free to do so.
Mhm. Well, Mike, I want to thank you for being here. Michael Pastella is Associate Director of Leadership Development, State University of New York, College at Oswego, as we would say, Oswego, into the wild blue yonder. And this was Old Home Week. Both Mike and I are graduates of SUNY Potsdam,
That's right.
and we are wearing all of our Potsdam bling tonight. I'd like to thank
So
Mike for
go
being here,
Bears.
and thanks to Cassandra Williams, who is the brains behind Educational Innovations 360 Degrees and allows us to use her channel. And thank you to our guests who are here to enjoy this conversation with us. And I wish you all a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Good night.
Good night.